Hey guys, welcome to the Dirty First channel. This is Cooper, and I wanted to get some practice in behind the microphone with just reading and getting comfortable talking for extended periods of time and getting adjusted to reading different things and occasionally reading off a script or whatever. And I don't want to read off a script, but I have ADHD makes reading and kind of staying focused on some things very difficult. So I don't need a script per se, but just I really like having just a little something short that can kind of help guide me through whatever I'm talking about. And for today, I'm actually going to be, and I'm gonna take my stab at it, and I'm just gonna post all of these on the Dirty First channel as well. Um, but I'm going to take a stab at maybe reading some audiobooks here in the future, just because it's I enjoy reading books, and it seems like a very lucrative thing to do, but it also seems like a very enjoyable thing to do. Just being able to sit down and read a book. Um, so yeah, this is a Brain on Music: The Science of Human Obsession by Daniel J. Levitin. Um, I'm not really gonna worry too much about. Let's see how. I guess we'll see how long the introduction is. See how many pages it is. Let's see. Okay, so it's 12 pages. So let's see, how much of this do I want to get through? How long is the book? Okay, it's 300 pages. So, I don't know. Let's just start reading. I'm gonna start here at the introduction, and we'll kind of go from there. I love music and I love science. Why would I want to mix the two? I love science, and it pains me to think that so many are terrified of the subject or feel that choosing science means you cannot also choose compassion, or the arts, or be awed by nature. Science is not meant to cure us of mystery, but to reinvent and reinvigorate us. Robert Splotsky, Why Zebras Don't Get Ulcers, Part 7. In the summer of 1969, when I was 11, I bought a stereo system at the local hi-fi shop. It cost all of $100. I had earned weeding the neighbors' gardens that spring at 75 cents an hour. I spent long hours in my room listening to records. Cream, the Rolling Stones, Chicago, Simon and Garfunkel, Bizet, Chichas, Ch- Ch- Chiscott. I'm not even gonna try right now. Tchaikovsky, whatever. George Shearling and the saxophonist Boots Randolph. And I didn't listen particularly loud, at least not compared to my college days when I was actually set my loudspeakers on fire by cranking up the volume too high, but the noise was evidently too much for my parents. My mother is a novelist, and she wrote every day in the den just down the hall and played the piano for an hour every night before bed. My father was a businessman. He worked 80-hour weeks. 40 of those hours was in his office at home on evenings and weekends. Being the businessman that he was, my father made me a proposition. He would buy me a pair of headphones if I would promise to use them when he was home. Those headphones forever changed the way I listen to music. The new artists I was listening to were all exploring stereo mixing for the first time. Because the speakers that came with my $100 all-in-one stereo system weren't very good, I had never before heard the depth that I could hear in the headphones, the placement of the instruments, both in the left right field and the front back, reverberant space. To me, records are no longer just about songs anymore, but about sound. Headphones opened up a world of sonic colors, a palette of nuances and details that went far beyond the chords and melody, the lyrics, or a particular singer's voice. The swampy, deep south ambience of Green River by Creedence, or the pastoral open space beauties of the Beatles' Mother Nature's Son. The oboes in Beethoven's Sixth, conducted by Karajan, faint and drenched the atmosphere of a large wooden stone church. The sound was an enveloping experience. Headphones also made the music more personal for me. It was suddenly coming from inside my head, not there, not out there in the world. This personal connection is ultimately what drove me to become a recording engineer and producer. Many years later, Paul Simon told me that the sound is always what he was after too. The way I listen to my own records is for the sound of them all, not the chords or lyrics. My first impression of the overall sound. I dropped out of college after the incident with my speakers in my dorm room, and I joined a rock band. We got good enough to record at a 24-track studio in California with a talented engineer, Mark Needham, who went on to record hits like Chris Isaac, Cake, and Fleetwood Mac. Mark took a liking to me, probably because I was the only one interested in going in the control room to hear back what we sounded like. While the others were more interested in getting high in between takes, Mark treated me like a producer, although I didn't know what one was at the time, asking me what the band wanted to sound like. He taught me how much of a difference the sound a microphone could make, or even the influence of how a microphone was placed. At first, I didn't hear some of the differences he pointed out, but he taught me what to listen for. Notice when I put this microphone closer to the guitar amp, the sound becomes fuller, rounder, and more even. But when I put it further back, it picks up some of the sound of the room, giving it more spacious sound. Although you lose some of the mid-range if I do that. Our band became moderately well known in San Francisco, and our tapes played on local rock radio stations. When the band broke up due to the guitarist's frequent suicide attempts and the vocalist's nasty habit of taking nitrous oxide and cutting himself with razor blades, I never found work as a producer of other bands. I learned to hear things that I had never heard before, the difference between one microphone and another, even between one brand of recording tape and another. Apex 456 tape had a characteristic bump in the low frequency range. Scotch 250 had characteristic crispness in the high frequencies, and AFGA 467 a luster in the mid range. Once I knew what I could listen for, I could tell Apex from Scotch or AFGA tape as easy as I could tell an apple from a pear or an orange. I progressed to work with other great engineers like Leslie Ann Jones, who had worked with Frank Sinatra and Bobby McFerrin, Fred Catero, Chicago, and Janis Joplin, and Jeff Norman, John Fogerty, and the Grateful Dead. Even though I was the producer, the one in charge of the sessions, I was intimidated by all of them. Some of the engineers let me sit in on their sessions with other artists such as Hart, Journey, Santana, Whitney Houston, and Aretha Franklin. I got a lifetime of education watching them interact with the artists, talking about subtle nuances in how a guitar part was articulated or how a vocal performance had been delivered. They would talk about syllabistics in a lyric and choose among 10 different performances they could hear so well, and how did they train their ears train to hear those things? How did they train their ears to hear things that mere mortals couldn't? While working with small, unknown bands, I got to know the studio managers and engineers, and they steered me towards better and better work. For one day, an engineer didn't show up, and I spliced some tape edits for Carlos Santana. Another time, the great producer Sandy Pearlman went out for lunch during a Blue Oyster Cult session and left me in charge to finish the vocals. One thing led to another, and I spent over a decade producing records in California, and I was eventually lucky enough to be able to work with many well-known artists. But I also worked with dozens of musical no-names, people who are extremely talented but never made it, and I began to wonder why some musicians are household names and while others languish in obscurity. I also wondered why music seemed to come so easily to some and not to others. Where does creativity come from, and why do some songs move us and others leave us cold? And what about the role of perception in all of this, the uncanny ability of great musicians and engineers to hear nuances that most of us don't? These questions led me back to school for some answers. While still working as a record producer, I drove down to Stanford University twice a week with Sandy Pearlman to sit in on neuropsychology lectures by Carl Pribham. I found that psychology was the field that held the answers to some of my questions about memory, perception, creativity, and the common instrument underlying all of these, the human brain. But instead of finding answers, I came away with more questions. As is often the case in science, each new question opened my mind to an appreciation for the complexity of music, of the world, and of the human experience. As the philosopher Paul Churchland notes, humans have been trying to understand the world throughout the most of recorded history, and in just the past 200 years, our curiosity has revealed much of what nature has kept hidden from us, the fabric of space-time. the constitution of matter, and the many forms of energy. The origins of the universe, the nature of universe itself, with the discovery of DNA and the completion of the mapping of the human genome just 5 years ago. But one mystery has not been solved: the mystery of the human brain and how it gives rise to thoughts and feelings, hopes and desires, love, and the experience of beauty, not to mention dance, visual art, literature, and music. What is music? Where does it come from? Why do some sequences of sounds move us so, while others, such as dogs barking or cars screeching, make many people uncomfortable? For some of us, these questions occupy a larger part of our life's work. For others, the idea of picking a music apart in this way seems tantamount to studying the chemical structure in a Goya canvas, at the expense of seeing the art and the painter was trying to produce. At the expense of seeing the art that the painter was trying to produce. The Oxford historian Martin Kemp points out a similarity between artists and scientists. Most artists describe their work as experiments, part of a series of efforts designed to explore a common concern or established viewpoint. My good friend and colleague Willard Ford Thompson, a music cognition scientist and a composer at the University of Toronto, adds that the work of both scientists and artists involves similar stages of development: a creative and exploratory brainstorming stage, followed by the testing and refining stages that typically involve the application of set procedures, but are often informed by additional creative problem solving. Artists, artist studios and scientist laboratories share similarities as well, with much a large number of projects going at once in various stages of incompletion. Both require specialized tools, and the results are, unlike the final plans for a suspension bridge or the tallying of money in a bank account at the end of the business day, open to interpretation. What artists and scientists have in common is the ability to live in an open-ended state of interpretation and reinterpretation of the products of our work. The work of artists and scientists is ultimately the pursuit of truth, but the members of both camps understand that truth in its very nature is contextual and changeable, dependent on the point of view, and that today's truths become tomorrow's disproven hypothesis or forgotten objects d'art. One need look no further at Piaget, Freud, and Skinner to find theories that once held widespread currency and were later overturned or at least dramatically reevaluated. In music, a number of groups were prematurely held up as of lasting importance. Cheap Trick were hailed as the new Beatles, and at one point, the Rolling Stone Encyclopedia of Rock devoted as much space to Adam and the Ants as they did to U2. There were times when people couldn't imagine a day when most of the world would not know the names of Paul Stuckey, Criss Cross, or Mary Ford. For the artist, the goal of painting or musical composition is to not convey literal truth, but as an aspect of a universal truth that, if successful, will continue to move and to touch people even as context, societies, and culture changes. For the scientist, the goal of a theory is to convey truth for now. To replace an old truth while accepting that someday this theory too will be replaced by a new truth, because this is the way science advances. Music is unusual among all human activities for both its ubiquity and antiquity. No human culture now or any time in the recorded past lacked music. Some of the oldest physical artifacts found in human and proto-human that's what it was. And proto-human excavation sites are musical instruments. Bone flutes and animal skin stretched over tree stumps to make drums. Whenever humans come together for any reason, music is there. Weddings, funerals, graduation from college, men marching off to war, stadium sporting nights, a night on the town, prayer, a romantic dinner, mothers rocking their infants to sleep, and college students studying with music as a background. Even more so in non-industrialized countries than in modern Western societies. Music is and was a part of the fabric of everyday life. Only relatively recently to our own culture, 500 years or so ago, did a distinction arise that cut society in two, forming separate classes of music performers and music listeners. Throughout most of the world and for most of human history, music making was as natural an activity as breathing and walking. Everyone participated. Concert halls dedicated to the performance of music arose only in the last several centuries. Jim Ferguson, whom I have known since high school, is now a professor of anthropology. Jim is one of the funniest and most fiercely intelligent people I know, but he is shy. I don't know how he manages to teach his lecture courses. For his doctoral degree at Harvard, he performed field work in Lesotho, a small nation completely surrounded by South Africa. There, studying and interacting with local villagers, Jim patiently earned their trust until one day he was asked to join in one of their songs. So typically, when asked to sing with these Sotho villagers, Jim said in a soft voice, "I don't sing." And it was true. We had been in a high school band together, and although he was an excellent oboe player, he couldn't carry a tune in a bucket. The villagers found his objection puzzling and inexplicable. The Sotho considered singing an ordinary everyday activity performed by everyone, young and old, men and women, and not an activity reserved for a special few. Our culture and indeed our very language makes a distinction between a class of expert performers, the Arthur Rubinsteins, Ella Fitzgeralds, and Paul McCartneys, and the rest of us. The rest of us pay money to hear experts entertain us, and Jim knew he wasn't much of a singer or dancer. And to him, a public display of singing and dancing implied he thought of himself as an expert. These villagers just stared at Jim and said, "What do you mean you don't sing? You talk." Jim told me later it was odd to them as if I told them I couldn't walk or dance, even though I have both my legs. Singing and dancing were a natural activity in everybody's lives, seamlessly integrated and involving everyone. This Sesolo verb for singing, hobina, as many of the world's languages, also means to dance. There is no distinction, since it is assumed that singing involves bodily movement. A couple of generations ago, before television, many families would sit around and play music together for entertainment. Nowadays, there is a great emphasis on technique and skill, and whether a musician is good enough to play for others. Music making has become a somewhat reserved activity in our culture, and the rest of us listen. The music industry is one of the largest in the United States, employing hundreds of thousands of people. Album sales alone bring in 30 billion a year, and this figure doesn't even account for concert ticket sales and the thousands of bands playing Friday nights at saloons all over North America, or the 30 billion songs that were downloaded free through peer-to-peer file sharing in 2005. Americans spend more money on music than on sex or prescription drugs. Given this vicarious consumption, I would say that most Americans qualify as expert music listeners. We have the cognitive capacity to detect wrong notes, to find music we enjoy, to remember hundreds of melodies, and to tap our feet in time with the music, an activity that involves a process of meter extraction so complicated that most computers cannot do it. Why do we listen to music, and why are we willing to spend so much money on music listening? 2 concert tickets can easily cost as much as a week's food allowance for a family of 4, and one CD costs it costs about the same as a work shirt, 8 loaves of bread, or basic phone service for a month. Understanding why we like music and what draws us to it is a window on the essence of human nature. To ask questions about a basic and omnipresent human ability is to implicitly to ask questions about emotion. Animals evolved certain physical forms as a response to their environment, and the characteristics that conferred as an advantage from mating and were passed down to the next generation through the genes. A subtle point in Darwinian theory is that living organisms, whether plants, viruses, insects, or animals, co-evolved with the physical world. In other words, while all living things are changing and in response to the world is also changing in response to them. If one species develops a mechanism to keep away a particular predator, that predator's species is then under evolutionary pressure to either develop a means to overcome that defense or to find another food source. Natural selection is an arms race of physical morphologies changing to catch up with one another. A relatively new scientific field, evolutionary psychology, extends the notion of evolution from the physical to the realm of the mental. My mentor when I was a student at Stanford University, the cognitive psychologist Roger Shepard, notes that that notes that not just our bodies but our minds are the product of million years of evolution. Our thought patterns, our predispositions to solve problems in certain ways, our sensory systems, such as the ability to see color, and the particular ones we see, are all products of evolution. Shepard pushes the point that further, our minds co-evolved with the physical world and changing in response to ever-changing conditions. Three of Shepard's students, Leda Crossmans and John Tooby of the University of California at Santa Barbara, and Jeffrey Miller at the University of New Mexico, are among those at the forefront of this new field. Researchers in this field believe that they can learn a lot about human behavior by considering the evolution of the mind. What function did music serve mankind as we were evolving and developing? Certainly the music of 50,000 and 100,000 years ago is very different from Beethoven, Van Halen, or Eminem. Our music, as our brains have evolved, so has the music we make with them, and the music that we want to hear. Did particular regions and pathways evolve in our brains specifically for making and listening to music? Contrary to the old simplistic notion that art and music are processed in the right hemispheres of our brains, with the language and mathematics in the left. Recent findings from my laboratory and those of my colleagues are showing that that music is distributed throughout the brain. Throughout thorough studies of people with brain damage, we've seen with patients who have lost the ability to read a newspaper but can still read music, or individuals who can play the piano but lack the proper motor coordination to button their own sweater. Music listening, performance, and composition engage nearly every area of the brain that we have so far identified and involved nearly every neural subsystem. Could this fact account for the claims that music listening exercises parts of our mind that listening to Mozart 20 minutes a day will make us smarter? The power of music to evoke emotions is harnessed by advertising executives, filmmakers, military commanders, and mothers. Advertisers use music to make a soft drink, beer, running shoe, or car seem more hip than their competitors. Film directors use music to tell us how to feel about scenes that otherwise might be ambiguous, or to augment our feelings at particular dramatic moments. Think of a typical chase scene in an action film, or the music that might accompany a lone woman climbing a staircase in a dark old mansion. Music is being used to manipulate our emotions, and we tend to accept, if not outright enjoy, the power of music to make us experience these different feelings. Mothers throughout the world and as far back as time as we can imagine have used soft singing to soothe their babies to sleep, or to distract them from something that makes them cry, that has made them cry. Many people who love music profess to know nothing about it. I found that many of my colleagues who study difficult, intricate topics such as neurochemistry or psychopharmacology feel unprepared to deal with research in the neuroscience of music. And who can blame them? Music theorists have an arcane, rarefied set of terms and rules that are as obscure as some of the most esoteric domains of mathematics. To the non-musician, the blobs of ink on a page that we call music notation might as well just be the notations of a mathematical set theory. Talk of keys, cadences, modulation, and transposition can be baffling. Yet to every one of my colleagues who feel intimidated by such jargon can tell me that music he or she likes. My friend Norman White is a world authority on the hippocampus and rats, and how they remember different places they've visited. He's a huge jazz fan and can talk expertly about his favorite artists. He can instantly tell the difference between Duke Ellington and Count Basie by the sound of the music, and can even tell early Louis Armstrong from late. Norm doesn't have any knowledge about music in the technical sense. He can tell me that he likes a certain song, but he can't tell me what the names of the chords are. He is, however, an expert in knowing things that he likes. This is not unusual, of course. Many of us have a practical knowledge of things we like, and can communicate our preferences without possessing the technical knowledge of the true expert. I know that I prefer the chocolate cake at one restaurant I often go to over the chocolate cake at a neighborhood coffee shop. But only a chef would be able to analyze the cake to decompose the taste experience into its elements by describing the differences in the kind of flour, or the shortening, or the type of chocolate used. It's a shame that many people are intimidated by the jargon musicians, music theorists, and cognitive scientists throw around. There is specialized vocabulary in every field of inquiry. Try to make sense of a full blood analysis report from your doctor. But, in the case of music, music experts and scientists could do a better job of making their work accessible. That is something I try to accomplish in this book. The natural gap that has grown between musical performance and music listening has been paralleled by a gap between those who love music and love to talk about it, and those who are discovering new things about it, how it works. A feeling my students often confide into me is that they love life and that its mysteries, and that they're afraid that too much education will steal away many of life's simple pleasures. Robert Splonsky's students have probably confided much the same to him, and I myself felt the same anxiety in 1979 when I moved to Boston to attend the Berklee College of Music. What if I told a scholarly approach to studying music and analyzing it, stripped of its mysteries? What if I became so knowledgeable about the music that I no longer took pleasure from it? I still take as much pleasure from music as I did from the cheap hi-fi through those headphones. The more I learned about music and science, the more fascinating they became. And the more I was able to appreciate people who were really good at them. Like science, music over the years has proven to be an adventure, never experienced exactly the same way twice. It has been a source of continual surprise and satisfaction for me. It turns out science and music aren't such a bad mix. This book is about the science of music, and from the perspective of cognitive neuroscience, the field that is an intersection of psychology and neurology. I'll discuss some of the latest studies and other researchers in our field have conducted on music, musical meaning, and musical pleasure. They offer new insights into profound questions. If all of us hear music differently, how can we account for the pieces that seem to move so many people? Handel's Messiah, or Don McLean's Vincent, Starry, Starry Night, for example. On the other hand, if we all hear music in the same way, how can we account for the wide differences in musical preference? Why is it that one man's Mozart is another man's Madonna? The mind has been opened up in the last few years by exploding the field of neuroscience and the new approaches in psychology due to brain imaging technologies, drugs able to manipulate neurotransmitters such as dopamine and serotonin, and plain old scientific pursuit. Less well known are the extraordinary advances that we've been able to make in modeling how our neurons network, thanks to the continuing revolution in computer technology. We're coming to understand computational systems in our head like never before. Language now seems to be substantially hardwired into our brains. Even consciousness is no longer hopelessly surrounded in a mystical fog, but it is rather something that emerges from observable physical spaces, but no one until now has taken all this new work together and used it to occlude to what is to me the most beautiful human obsession. Your brain on music is a way to understand the deepest mysteries of human nature. This is why I wrote this book. This is written for the general reader and not for my colleagues. So I've tried to simplify topics without oversimplifying them. All the research described herein has been vetted by the peer review process and appeared in referred journals. The details of Your Brain on Music are contained in the notes at the end. By better understanding what music is and where it comes from, we may be able to better understand our motives, fears, desires, memories, and even communication in the broadest sense. Is music listening more along the lines of eating when you're hungry and thus satisfying an urge, or is it more like seeing a beautiful sunset and getting a back rub, which triggers sensory pleasures in the brain? Why do people seem to get stuck in their musical tastes as they get older and cease to experiment with new music? This is the story of how brains and music co-evolved This is the story of how brains and music co-evolved, and what music can teach us about the brain, what the brain can teach us about music, and what both can teach us about ourselves. Chapter 1. What is music? From pitch to timbre. What is music? To many, music can only mean the great masters, Beethoven, Debussy, and Mozart. To others, music is Busta Rhymes, Dr. Dre, and Moby. To one of my saxophone teachers at Berklee College of Music, and to the legions of traditional jazz aficionados, anything made before 1940 or after 1960 isn't really music at all. And I had friends when I was a kid in the 60s who used to come over to my house and listen to the Monkees album, Monkees, because their parents forbade them to listening to anything but classical music. And others whose parents would only let them listen to and sing religious hymns, in both cases fearing the dangerous rhythms of rock and roll. When Bob Dylan dared to play an electric guitar at the Newport Folk Festival in 1965, people walked out, and many of those who stayed booed. The Catholic Church banned music that contained polyphony, more than one musical part playing at a time, fearing that it would cause people to doubt the unity of God. The church also banned the musical interval of augmented fourth, the distance between C and F sharp, and also known as tritone. In the interval in Leonard Bernstein's West Side Story, when Tony sings the name Maria, this interval was considered so dissonant that it must have been the work of Lucifer, and so the church named it Diabolus in Musica. It was pitch that had the medieval church in an uproar, and it was timbre that Dylan booed. It was the latent African rhythms in rock that frightened white suburban parents, and perhaps fearful that the beat would induce a permanent mind-altering trance in their innocent children. What rhythm, pitch, and timbre are merely the ways of describing different mechanical aspects of a song, or do they have a deeper neurological basis? Are all of these elements necessary? The music of avant-garde composers such as Francis Dumont, Robert Normandeau, or Pierre Schoeffer stretches the bounds of what most of us think music is, going beyond the use of melody and harmony, and even beyond the use of instruments. These composers used recordings of found objects in the world such as jackhammers, trains, and waterfalls. They edit the recordings, play with their pitch, and ultimately combine them into an organized collage of sound in which the same type of emotional trajectory, the same tension and release as the traditional music. Composers in this tradition are like the painters who stepped out of the boundaries of representational and realistic art. The Cubists, the Dadaists, and many of the modern painters from Picasso to Kandinsky to Mondrian. What do the music of Bach, Deepak Mode, and John Cage fundamentally have in common? On the most basic level, what distinguishes Busta Rhymes' What's It Gotta Be or Beethoven's Pathetique Sonata from say the collections of sounds you'd hear standing in the middle of Times Square, or those you'd hear deep in a rainforest. As the composer Edgar Varese famously defined it, music is organized sound. This book derives a neurophysical perception on how music affects our brains and our minds, our thoughts and our spirit. But first, it is to help examine what music is made of. What are the fundamental building blocks of music, and how, when organized, do they give rise to music? The basic elements of any sound are loudness, pitch, contour, duration or rhythm, tempo, timbre, spatial location, and reverberation. Our brains organize these fundamental perpetual attributions into higher level concepts, just as the painter arranges lines into forms, and these include meter, harmony, and melody. When we listen to music, we are actually perceiving multiple attributes or dimensions. Before getting to the brain basis of all this, I'd like to take this chapter to define the musical terms and quickly review some basic ideas in musical theory and illustrate them with musical examples. Musicians may want to skip or skim this chapter. First, here's a brief summary of the main terms. Pitch is purely psychological construct, related both to the actual frequency of a particular tone and to its relative position in the musical scale. It provides the answer to the question, what note is that? It's a C sharp, and I'll define frequency and musical scale below. When a trumpet player blows into his instrument and makes a single sound, he makes what most of us call a note, and what scientists call a tone. The two terms tone and note refer to the same entity in the abstract, but we reserve the word tone for what you hear, and the word note for what you actually see in a musical score. In the nursery rhymes, Mary Had a Little Lamb, and Are You Sleeping, pitch is the only thing that varies in the first 7 notes, and the rhythm stays the same. This demonstrates the power and fundamentality of pitch in defining a melody or song. Rhythm refers to the durations of a series of notes, and to the way that they group together into units. For example, in the alphabet song, the same as Twinkle Twinkle Little Star, the first 6 notes of the song are all equal in duration as we sing the names of the letters A, B, C, D, E, F, and then we hold the G for twice the duration. Then we're back to the same duration for H, I, J, K, and for the following 4 letters, then are sung in half the duration for twice as fast per letter, L, M, N, O, P, and then ending with held on a held P, leading generations of school children to spread several early months believing that there was a letter in the English alphabet called LMNO. In the Beach Boys songs Barbara Ann, the first 7 notes are all sung on the same pitch, with only the rhythm varying. In fact, the 7 notes after that are all sung on the same pitch as well in the melody. As Dean Torrance of Jan and Dean is joined by other voices singing other notes, harmony, the Beatles have several songs in which pitch is held constant and only rhythm varies across several notes. The first 4 notes of Come Together and the 6 notes of Hard Day's Night, following the lyric It's Been a, and the first 6 notes of Something. Tempo refers to the overall speed or pace of the piece. If you were tapping your foot, dancing, or marching to the piece, it's how fast or slow these regular movements would be. Contour describes the overall shape of a melody, taking into account only the pattern of up and down, whether a note goes up or down, not the amount by which it goes up or down. Timbre rhymes with amber, distinguishes one instrument from another, say, trumpet from piano. When both are playing at the same written note, it is a similar tonal color that is produced in part by overtones from the instrument's vibrations. More on that later. It describes the way that a single instrument can change the sound as it moves across its range. Say the warm sound of a trumpet low in its range versus the piercing sound of that same trumpet sound playing its highest note. Loudness is a purely psychological construct that relates non-linearly and in poorly understood ways to understand how energy in an instrument creates, how much air it displaces, and what an acoustician would call the amplitude of a tone. Reverberation refers to the perception of how distant a source is from us, and in combination with how large a room or hall the music is in, often referred to as echo by lay people. It is a quality that distinguishes the spaciousness of singing in a large concert hall from the sound of singing in your shower, as it has an underappreciated role in communicating an emotion and creates an overall pleasuring sound. Psychophysicists, scientists who study the ways that the brain interacts with the physical world, have shown that these attributes are separable. Each can be varied without altering the others, allowing the scientific study of one at a time. I can change the pitches in a song without changing the rhythm, and I can play a song on a different instrument, changing the timbre, without changing the duration or pitches of the notes. The difference between music and a random or disordered set of sounds has to do with the way these fundamental attributes combine, and the relations that form between them. When these basic elements combine and form relationships with one another in a meaningful way, they give rise to higher order concepts such as meter, key, melody, and harmony. Meter is created by our brains by extracting information from which rhythm and loudness cues, and refers to the way in which tones are grouped together with one another across time. A waltz meter organizes tones into groups of 3, a march into groups of 2 or 4. Key has to do with a hierarchy of importance that exists between key tones in a musical piece. This hierarchy does not exist in the world, it only exists in our minds, as it is a function of our experiences with a musical style and musical idioms and mental schemes that all of us develop for understanding music. Melody is the main theme of a musical piece, the part you sing along with, and the succession of tones that are most salient in your mind. The notion of melody is different across genres. In rock music, there is typically a melody for the verses and a melody for the chorus, and verses are distinguished by a change in the lyrics and sometimes a change in the instrumentation. In classical music, the melody is the starting point for the composer to create variations on that theme, which may be used throughout the entire piece in different forms. Harmony has to do with relationships between the pitches of different tones and tonal contexts that these pitches set up and ultimately lead to expectations for what will come next in a musical piece. Expectations that a skillful composer can either meet or violation for artistic and expressive purposes. Harmony can mean simply a parallel melody to the primary one, as when two singers harmonize, or it can refer to a chordal progression, the clusters of notes that form a context and background on which the melody rests. I'll be elaborating on all these as we go along. The idea of primitive elements combining to create art and the importance of relationships between elements also exists in visual art and in dance. The fundamental elements of visual perception include color, which itself can be decomposed into 3 dimensions of hue, saturation, and lightness. Brightness, location, texture, and shape. But a painting is more than these, and is not just a line here and another there, or a spot of red in one part of the picture and a patch of blue in another. What makes a set of lines and colors into art is the relationship between this line and that one, and the way one color or form echoes another in a different part of the canvas. Those dabs of paint and lines become art when form and flow. The other way in which your eyes draw across the canvas are created out of lower level perceptual elements. When they combine and harmoniously, they give rise to perceptive foreground and background, and ultimately to emotion and other aesthetic attributes. Similarly, dance is not just a raging sea of unrelated bodily movements. The relationship of these movements is to create another is what creates integrity and in into integral yeah a coherence and cohesion that the levels of our brain process. Man, I done stumbled over that part. My mouth just kind of vomited there for a minute. I don't know what's going on, man. Take me a drink of water on the camera. Actually, not on camera, on microphone. You know how rappers get that good lean sip? We get that good water sip. Know what I'm saying? Stay hydrated, boys. Back onto the book. As in visual art, music plays on not just what notes are sounded, but what ones are not. Miles Davis famously described his improvisation technique as a parallel to the way that Picasso described his use of canvas. The most critical aspect of the work, both artists said, was not the object themselves, but the space between objects. In Miles' case, he described the most important part of his solos as the empty space between notes, the air that he placed between one note and the next. Knowing precisely when to hit the next one, and allowing the listener time to anticipate it, is a hallmark of Davis's genius. This is particularly apparent in his album Kind of Blue. To non-musicians, terms such as diatonic, cadence, or even key and pitch can throw up an unnecessary barrier. Musicians and critics sometimes appear to live behind a veil of technical terms that can sound pretentious. And how many times have you read a concert review in the newspaper and found that you had no idea what the reviewer was saying? Her sustained apogorith was flawed by an inability to complete the roulade, or I can't believe that they modulated to a C sharp minor. How ridiculous! What we really want to know is whether or not the music was performed in a way that moved the audience, whether the singer seemed to inhabit, inhabit the character she was singing about. You might want to review to compare tonight's performance to that of a previous night or a different ensemble. We're usually interested in the music, not the technical devices that were used on. We wouldn't stand for if it was a restaurant reviewer started to speculate about the precise temperature at which the chef introduced the lemon juice in a Hollandaise sauce, or if a film critic talked about the aperture of the lens that his cinematographer used. We shouldn't stand for it in music either. Moreover, those who study music, even musicologists and scientists, disagree about what is meant by some of those terms. We employ the different timbre. Wow, that's a new word for me. Timbre, for example, to refer to the overall sound or tonal color of an instrument. Then indescribable character that distinguishes a trumpet from a clarinet when they're playing the same written note, or what distinguishes your voice from Brad Pitt's, if you're saying the same words. But an inability to agree on a definition has caused the scientific community to take the unusual step of throwing up its hands and defining timbre by what it is not. The official definition of Acoustical Society of America is that timbre is everything about a sound that is not loudness or pitch. So much for scientific precision. What is pitch and where does it come from? Simple question has hundreds of scientific articles and thousands of experiments. Almost all of us, even without musical training, can tell if a singer is off key. We might even not be able to say whether she is sharp or flat, or by how much. But after the age of 5, after the age of 5, most humans have a refined ability to detect tones that are out of tune, as to discriminate a question from an accusation. In English, a rising pitch indicates a question, or a straightforward falling pitch indicates an accusation. This comes from an interaction between our exposure to music and the physics of sound. What we call pitch is related to the frequency or rate of vibration of a string, column of air, or other physical source. If a string is vibrating so that it moves back and forth 60 times in 1 second, we say that it is frequency of 60 cycles per second. The unit of measurement, cycles per second, is often called hertz, abbreviated H, capital H, lowercase z, after Heinrich Hertz, the German theoretical physicist, who was the first to transmit radio waves in a dyed-in-the-wool theocratin. When asked what practical use radio waves might have, he reportedly shrugged, none. If you were to try to mimic the sound of a fire engine siren, your voice would sweep through the different pitches or frequencies as the tension in your vocal cords folds, some low and some high. Keys on the left of the piano keyboard strike longer, thicker strings that vibrate at a relatively slow rate. Keys to the right strike shorter, thinner strings that vibrate at a higher rate. The vibration of these strings displaces air molecules and causes them to vibrate at the same rate. With the same frequency as the string, these vibrating air molecules are what reach our eardrum, and they cause our eardrum to wiggle in and out at the same frequency. And the only information that our brains get about the pitch of sound comes from the wiggling in and out of our eardrum. Our inner ear and our brain have to analyze the motion of the eardrum or in order to figure out what the vibrations out there in the world cause the eardrum to move that way. Although I said that air molecules vibrate, other molecules vibrate too. We can hear music underwater or in fluids if the water or other fluid molecules are caused to vibrate. But in the vacuum of space with no molecules to vibrate, there is no sound. The next time you're watching Star Trek and hear the roar of the engine in space, you're having some good Trekkie trivia to share. By convention, when we press keys nearer to the near to the left of the keyboard, we say that they are low-pitched sounds, and the ones on the right side of the keyboard are high-pitched sounds. That is what we call low. And those are the sounds that vibrate slowly and are closer in vibration frequency to the sound of a large dog barking. What we call high are those sounds that vibrate rapidly and are closer to what a simple yip yip dog might make. But even these terms, high and low, are culturally relative. The Greeks talked about sounds in the opposite way, because the stringed instruments that they built tended to be orientated vertically. Shorter strings or pipe organ tubes had their tops closer to the ground, and so these were called the low notes, as in low to the ground. And the longer strings and tubes reaching towards Zeus and Apollo were also called the high notes. Low and high, just like left and right, are effectively arbitrary terms that ultimately have to be memorized. Some writers have argued that high and low are intuitive labels, noting that what we call high-pitched sounds come from birds who are high up in the trees or in the sky, and what we call low-pitched sounds often come from the large, close-to-the-ground mammals such as bears, or the low sounds of an earthquake. But this is not convincing, since low sounds also come from up high. Think of thunder. Think of thunder. And high sounds can also come from down low. Crickets and squirrels. Leaves being crushed underfoot. As the first definition of pitch, let's say it is the quality that primarily distinguishes the sound that is associated with pressing one piano key versus another. Pressing a piano key causes a hammer to strike one or more strings inside the piano. Striking a string displaces it, stretching it a bit, and its inherent resiliency causes it to return to its original position, but it overshoots that original position, going too far in the opposite direction, and then attempts to return to its original position again, overshooting it again, and in this way it oscillates back and forth. Each oscillation covers less distance, and in time the string stops moving altogether. This is why the sound you hear when you press a piano key gets shorter until it trails off into nothing. The distance that a string covers with each oscillation back and forth is translated by our brains into loudness. The rate at which it oscillates translates into pitch. The further the string travels, the louder the sound seems to us, which, when it is barely traveling at all, the sound seems soft. Although it might be counterintuitive, the distance traveled and the same rate of oscillation are independent. A string can vibrate very quickly and transverse either a great distance or a small one. This distance it traverses is relative to how hard we hit it. Thus it corresponds to our intuition that hitting something harder makes a louder sound. The rate at which the string vibrates is principally affected by its size and how tightly the string is, and not by how hard it was struck. It might seem as though we simply say that pitch is the same as frequency, that is, the frequency of air molecules. This is almost true. Mapping the physical world into the mental world is seldom so straightforward, and as we'll see later, however, for most sounds, pitch and frequency are closely related. The word pitch refers to the mental representation an organism has on the fundamental frequency of a sound. That is, pitch is a purely psychological phenomenon referred to the frequency of vibrating air molecules. By physiological, I mean that it is entirely in our heads and not in a world out there, and not in the world out there. It is the end product of a chain of mental events that gives rise to an entirely subjective internal mental representation or quality. Sound waves, molecules of air vibrating at frequencies, do not themselves have a pitch. Their motion and oscillations can be measured, but it takes a human or animal brain to map them to that internal quality we call pitch. We perceive color in a similar way, and as it was Isaac Newton who realized this. Isaac, who first realized this. Newton, of course, is known as the discoverer of gravity and the inventor of, along with Leibniz, of calculus. Like Einstein, Newton was a very poor student, and his teachers often complained of his inattentiveness. Newton was the first to point out that light is colorless, and consecutively, color has to occur inside our brains. He wrote, "The waves themselves are not colored. Since his time, we have learned that the light waves are characterized by different frequencies of oscillation, and when they impinge on the retina of an observer, they set off a chain of neurochemical events, the end product of which is an internal mental image that we call color. The essential point here is, what we perceive as color is not made up of color. Although an apple may appear red, its atoms themselves are not red. And similarly, as the philosopher Daniel Dennett points out, heat is not made up of tiny hot things. A bowl of pudding only has taste when I put it in my mouth. When it comes in contact with my tongue, it doesn't have any taste or flavor sitting in the fridge, only the potential. Similarly, the walls of my kitchen are not white when I leave the room. They still have paint on them, of course, but only color occurs when they interact with my eyes. Sound waves impinge on the eardrums and pinea, the fleshy parts of your ear, setting off a chain of chemical and neurochemical events, the product of which is an internal mental image we call pitch. If a tree falls in a forest and no one is there to hear it, does it make a sound? The question was first posed by Irish philosopher George Berkeley. Simply no. Sound is a mental image created by the brain in response to vibrating molecules. Similarly, there can be no pitch without a human or animal present. A suitable measuring device can register the frequency made by the tree falling, but truly it is not pitch until it is heard. No animal can hear a pitch for every frequency that exists, just as the colors we see are only a small portion of the entire electromagnetic spectrum. Sound can theoretically be heard for vibrations from just over 0 cycles per second up to 100,000 cycles per second or more. But each animal hears only a subset of the possible sounds. Humans who are not suffering from any sort of hearing loss can usually hear sounds from 20 Hz to 20,000 Hz. The pitches at the low end sound like an indistinct rumble or shaking, and this is the sound you hear when a truck goes by outside the window, its engine creating sound around 20 Hz. Or when a tricked out car with a fancy sound system has the subwoofer cranked up really loud. Some frequencies, those below 20 Hz, are inaudible to humans because the psychological properties of our ears aren't sensitive to them. The beats we hear on 50 Cent's In the Club or NWA's Express Yourself are near on the low end of the hearing range. The ending of A Day in the Life on the CD of the Beatles' Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club has a few seconds of sound at 15 Hz, inaudible to most adults over 40. If the Beatles had believed to never trust anyone over 40, this may have been their test. But Lennon reportedly just wanted something to make people's dogs perk up. The range of human hearing is generally 20 Hz to 20,000 Hz, but this doesn't mean the range of human pitch perception is the same. Although we can hear sounds in this entire range, they don't all sound musical. That is, we can't unambiguously assign a pitch to the entire range. By analogy, colors at the infrared and ultraviolet ends of the spectrum lack definition compared to the colors closer to the middle. The figure on page 23 shows the range of musical instruments and the frequencies associated with them. The sound of the average male speaking voice is around 110 Hz, and the average female speaking voice is around 220 Hz. The hum of fluorescent lights or from faulty wiring is 60 Hz in North America. In Europe and different countries with a different voltage current standard, it can be 50 Hz. The sound that a singer hears when she causes a glass to break might be 1,000 Hz. The glass breaks because it, like all physical objects, has a natural and inherent vibration frequency. You can hear this by flicking your finger against the sides, or if it's crystal, by running your wet finger down around the rim in a circular motion. When a singer hits the right frequency, the resonant frequency of the glass, it causes the molecules of the glass to vibrate at their natural rate, and they vibrate themselves apart. A standard piano has 88 keys. Very rarely, pianos can have a few extra ones at the bottom, and electronic pianos, organs, and synthesizers can have as few as 12 or 24 keys. But these are special cases. The lowest note on a standard piano vibrates with the frequency of 27.5 Hz. Interestingly, this is about the same rate of motion that constitutes an important threshold in visual perception. A sequence of still photographs slides displayed at or about this rate of perception will give the illusion of motion. Motion pictures are a sequence of still images presented at a rate 24 frames per second that exceeds the temporal resolving properties of the human visual system. In 35mm projection film, each image is represented for about 1/48th of a second, altering with a black frame of roughly equal duration as the lens is blocked out between successive still images. We perceive smooth, continuous motion when in fact there is no such thing actually being shown to us. Old-timey movies seem to flicker because their frame rate at 16 to 18 FPS was too low, and our visual system picked up on the discontinuities. When molecules vibrate around this sound, we hear something that sounds like a continuous note. But if you put playing cards in the spokes of your bicycle wheel when you were a kid, you demonstrated yourself a related principle. At slow speeds, you simply hear the click 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 of the card hitting the spokes. But above a certain point, the clicks run together and create a buzz, a tone you can actually hum along with, a pitch. When that lowest note on the piano plays and vibrates at 27.5 Hz, to most people it lacks the distinct pitch of sounds towards the middle of the keyboard. At the lowest and highest ends of the piano keyboard, the notes sound fuzzy, and to many people, with respect to their pitch, composers know this, and they either use these notes to avoid them, depending on what they sound like. Sorry, I had a little bit of a hiccup there, and my BlackBerry decided it wanted to go off. When that lowest note on the piano plays, it vibrates at 27.5 Hz. To most people, it lacks the distinct sounds towards the middle of the keyboard. At the lowest and highest ends of the piano keyboard, the notes sound fuzzy to many people with respect to their pitch. Composers know this, and they either use these notes or avoid them depending on what they are trying to accomplish compositionally and emotionally. Sounds with frequencies above the highest note on the keyboard, around 6,000 Hz and more, sound like a high-pitched whistling to most people. At 20,000 Hz, most humans don't hear a thing, and by the age of 60, most adults can't hear above 15,000 Hz, or so due to stiffening of their hair cells in their inner ear. So when we talk to people about the range of musical notes, or that restricted part of the piano keyboard that conveys the strongest sense of a pitch, we're talking about roughly 3/4 of the notes on the piano keyboard, between 55 Hz and 2000 Hz. Pitch is one of the primary means by which musical emotion is conveyed. Mood, excitement, calm, romance, and danger are all signaled by a number of factors, but pitch is among the most decisive. A single high note can convey excitement, and a single low note, sadness. When notes are strung together, we get more powerful and nuanced musical statements. Melodies are often defined by the pattern or relations of successive pitches across time. Most people have no trouble recognizing a melody that is played in a higher or lower key than what they've heard it in before. In fact, many melodies do not have a correct starting pitch, they just float freely in space, starting anywhere. Happy Birthday is an example of this. One way to think about a melody, then, is as an abstract prototype that is derived from specific combinations of key, tempo, instrumentation, and so on. A cognitive psychologist would say that a melody is an auditory object that maintains its identity in spite of transformations. Just as a chair maintains its identity when you move it to the other side of the room, turn it upside down, or paint it red. So, for example, if you hear a song played louder than you were accustomed to, you still identify it as the same song. The same holds for charges in the absolute pitch values of the song, which can be changed so long as the relative distances between them remain the same. The notion of related pitch values is seen readily in the way that we speak. When you ask someone a question, your voice naturally rises in intonation at the end of the sentence, signaling that you are asking. But you don't try to make it rise in the end. Rise in your voice match a specific pitch. It is enough that you end your sentence somewhat higher in the pitch than you began it. This is convention in English, though not in all languages. We have to learn it. and is known in some linguistics as a protistic cue. These similar conventions for music written in Western tradition. Certain sequences of pitches evoked uh, certain sequences of pitches evoke calm and others excitement. The slow and predominantly stepwise downward motion of the melody in Greg's Peer Gynt Suit Number 1 Morningwood conveys peacefulness, but in Anita's Dance from the same suit, the chromatic ascending lines with occasional and playful movement. The the brain basis for this is primarily based on learning. Just as we have just as we learn that a rising intonation indicates a question, all of us have the innate capacity to learn the linguistic and musical distinctions of whatever culture we are born into, and experience with the music of the culture that shapes our neural pathways so that we are ultimately internalize a set of rules common to that musical tradition. Different instruments use different parts of the range available. Different parts of the range available at different pitches. The piano has the largest range of any instrument, as you can see from the previous illustration. The other instruments each use a subset of the available pitches, and this influences the way instruments are used to communicate emotion. The piccolo, with its high-pitched, shrill, and bird-like sound, tends to evoke flighty, happy moods, regardless of the notes it's playing. Because of this, composers tend to use the piccolo for happy music or rousing music, as in a Sousa march. Similarly in Peter and the Wolf. Prokofiev uses the flute to represent the bird and the French horn to indicate the wolf. The character's individuality in Peter and the Wolf is expressed in the timbres of different instruments and each has a lemetov, an associated melodic phrase or figure that accompanies the reappearance of an idea, person, or situation. This is especially true of Wagnerian music drama. A composer who picks so-called the sad pitch sequences would only give those to the piccolo if he were trying to be ironic. The lumbering deep sounds of the tuba or double bass are often used to evoke solemnity, gravity, or weight. How many different pitches are there? Because pitch comes from continuum, the vibration frequencies of molecules, there are technically an infinite number of pitches. For every pair of frequencies you could mention, I could always come up with one in between them and a theoretical different pitch would exist. But not every change in frequency gives rise to a noticeable difference in pitch. Just as adding a grain of sand back to your backpack will not change the weight perceptibly, so not all frequency changes are musically useful. People differ in their ability to detect small changes in frequency. Training can help. But generally speaking, most cultures don't use distances smaller than a semitone as the basis for their music, and most people can't reliably detect changes smaller than about 1/10 of a semitone. The ability to detect differences in pitch is based on physiology and varies from one animal to another. How is it that we humans can tell pitches apart? The basilar membrane on the inner ear contains hair cells that are frequency selective, firing only in response to a certain band of frequencies. These are stretched out across the membrane from low frequencies to high. Low frequency sounds excite hair cells on one end of the basilar membrane. Medium frequency sounds excite the hair cells in the middle, and high frequency sounds excite them at the other end. We can think of the membrane as containing a map of different pitches very much like a piano keyboard superimposed on it. Because the different tones are spread out across the surface topography of the membrane, this is what is called a tonatomic map. After sounds enter the ear, they pass the basilar membrane where certain hair cells fire. Depending on the frequency of the sounds, the membrane acts like a motion detector lamp you might have in your garden. Activity in a certain part of the membrane causes it to send an electrical signal on up to the auditory cortex. The auditory cortex also has a tonotopic map, with low to high tones stretched out across the cortical surface. In this case, the brain also contains a map of different pitches, and different areas of the brain respond to different pitches. Pitch is so important and the brain represents it directly. Unlike almost any other musical attribute, we could place electrodes in the brain and be able to determine what pitches were being played to a person just by looking at the brain activity. And although music is based on pitch relations rather than absolute pitch values, it is paradoxically these absolute pitch values that the brain is paying attention to throughout its different stages of processing. This direct mapping of pitch is so important it bears repeating. If I put electrodes in your visual cortex, the part of your brain at the back of your head concerned with seeing, then I showed you a red tomato. There is no group of neurons that will cause my electrodes to turn red. But if I were to put electrodes in your auditory cortex and play a pure tone in your ears at 440 hertz, there are neurons in your auditory cortex that would fire at precisely that frequency, causing the electrode to emit electrical activity at 440 hertz. For pitch, what goes in your ear comes out the brain. A scale is just a subset of theoretically infinite number of pitches, and every culture selects these based on historical tradition or somewhat arbitrarily. The specific pitches chosen are then anointed as being part of that musical system. These letters you often see in the figure above. These names A, B, C, and so on are arbitrary labels that we associate with particular frequencies. In Western music of the European tradition, these pitches are the only legal pitches. Most instruments are designed to play these pitches and not the others. Instruments like the trombone and cello are an exception, because they can slide between notes. Trombonists, cellists, violinists, etc. spend a lot of time learning how to hear and produce the precise frequencies required to play each of the legal notes. Sounds in between are considered mistakes, out of tune, unless they are used for expressive intonation, intentionally playing something out of tune briefly to add emotional tension or in passing from one legal note to another. Tuning refers to the precise relationship between the frequency of a tone being played and a standard, or between two or more tones being played together. Orchestral musicians tuning up before performing are synchronizing their instruments, which naturally drift in their tuning as the wood, metal, and strings and other materials expand and contract with the changes in temperature and humidity, to a standard frequency, or occasionally not to a standard, but to each other. Expert musicians often alter the frequency of tones while they're playing for expressive purposes, except of course flex-pitched instruments such as keyboards and xylophones. Sounding a note slightly lower or higher than its nominal value can impart emotion when done skillfully. Expert musicians playing together in ensembles will also alter the pitch of tones when they play together to bring in more tune with the tones being played away from the other musicians, should one or more musicians drift away from standard tuning during the performance. The notes in Western music run from A to G, or an alternative system, do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti, do. The alternate system is used as lyrics to the Rodgers and Hammerstein song Do, re, mi from The Sound of Music. Do, a deer, a female deer, re, a drop of golden sun. As the frequencies get higher, so do the letter names. B has a frequency higher than A, and hence a higher pitch. And C has a higher frequency than either A or B. After G, the notes' names start all over again at A. Notes with the same names have frequencies that are double or a half the frequencies of each other. One of the standard notes we call A has a frequency of 110 Hz. The note with half that frequency, 55 Hz, is also an A, and the note is with twice 110 Hz, 220 Hz, is an A as well. But if we kept doubling the frequencies, we get more A's as well at 440 Hz, 880 Hz, 1760 Hz, and so on. Here is the fundamental quality of music. Note names repeat because of a perceptual phenomenon that corresponds to doubling and halving of frequencies. When we double or half a frequency, we end up with a note that sounds remarkably similar to the one we started out with. This relationship, a frequency ratio of 2 to 1 or 1 to 2, is called the octave. It is so important that, in spite of large differences that exist between musical cultures, between Indian, Balinesian, European and Middle Eastern, Chinese, and so on, every culture we know of has the octave as the basis for its music, even if it has little else in common with other musical traditions. The phenomenon leads to the notion of circularity in pitch perception, and is similar to circularity in colors. Although red and violet followed opposite ends of the continuum of visible frequencies of electromagnetic energy, we often we often see them described as perceptively similar. The same is true in music, and music is often described as having two dimensions, one that accounts for the tones going up in frequency and sounding higher and higher, and another accounts for the perceptual sense that we come back home again each time we double a tone's frequency. When men and women speak in unison, their voices are normally an octave apart, even if we try to speak in the exact same pitches. Children generally speak an octave or two higher than adults. The first two notes of the Harold Arlen melody "Over the Rainbow" from the movie Wizard of Oz make an octave. In Hot Fun in the Summertime by Sky and the Family Stone, Sly and his backup singers are singing in octaves during the first line of the verse. Each of the spring and Here She Comes Back. As we increase frequencies by playing the successful notes on an instrument, there is a very strong perceptual sense that we reach a doubling of frequency. We have to come home again. The octave is so basic that even some animal species, monkeys and cats, for example, show octave equivalence, the ability to treat as similar, the way that humans do, tones separated by this amount. An interval is the difference between two tones. The octave in Western music is subdivided into 12 logarithmically equally spaced tones. The intervallic distance between A and B, or between do and re, is called the whole step, or tone. This later term is confusing, since we call any musical sound a tone. I'll use the term whole step to avoid ambiguity. The smallest division in our Western scale cuts a whole step perceptually in half. The half step, or semitone, which is 1/12 of an octave. I'll use the word semitone because it is more common and because there is no ambiguity about what it means. Intervals are the basis of melody, much more so than actual pitches of notes. Melody processing is relational, not absolute, meaning that we can define a melody by its intervals, not the actual notes used to create them. Four semitones always create the interval known as major third, regardless of whether the first note is an A or G sharp, or any other note. See the table of the intervals, as they're known for in our Western musical system. The table could continue on. 13 semitones is a minor ninth, 14th semitones is a major ninth, but these names are typically only used in more advanced discussions. The intervals of the perfect fourth and the perfect fifth are called so because they sound perfectly pleasing to many people, and since the ancient Greeks, this particular feature of the scale is at the heart of all music. There is no imperfect fifth. This is just the name we've given the interval. Ignore the perfect fourth and fifth, or use them in every phrase. They have been the backbone of music for at least 5,000 years. Although the areas of the brain that respond to individual pitches have been mapped, we have not been able to find the neurological basis for the encoding of pitch relations. We know that each part of the cortex is involved in listening to the notes C and E, for example, and for F and A, but we do not know how or why both intervals are perceived as major third, or the neural circuits that create this perceptual equivalency. These relations must be extracted by a computational process in the brain that remains poorly understood. If there are 12 named notes within an octave, why are there only 7 letters, or do re mi syllables? After centuries of being forced to eat in the servants' quarters and to use the back of the castle, this may be an invention by musicians to make non-musicians feel inadequate. The additional 5 notes that have compound names such as E flat and F sharp. There is no reason for the system to be so complicated, but it is what we're stuck with. The system is a bit clearer looking at the piano keyboard. A piano has white keys and black keys spaced out in an uneven arrangement. Sometimes two white keys are adjacent, sometimes they have a black key between them. Whether the keys are white or black, the perceptual distance between one adjacent key to the next always makes a semitone, and the distance of two keys is always a whole step. This applies in many Western instruments. The distance between one fret on a guitar and the next is also a semitone, and pressing or lifting adjacent keys on a woodwind instrument such as the clarinet or oboe typically changes the pitch by a semitone. The white keys are named A, E, C, D, E, F, and G. The notes between the black keys are the ones with compound names. The note between A and B is either A sharp or B flat. And in all but formal music theoretic discussions, the terms are interchangeable. In fact, this note could also be referred to as C double flat, and similarly, A could be called G double sharp. But this is an even more theoretical usage. Sharp means high and flat means low. A B flat is the same note, one semitone lower than B. A sharp is the same note, one semitone higher than A. In the parallel do-re-mi system, unique syllables mark the other tones, D and Ra indicated in the tone between do and re, for example. The notes with compound names are not in any way second-class musical citizens. These are just as important, and in some songs, some scales, they are used exclusively. For example, the main accompaniment to Superstition by Stevie Wonder is played on only the black keys of the keyboard. The 12 notes taken together, plus the repeating cousins, one or more octaves apart, are the basic building blocks for melody. For all the songs in our culture, every song you know, from Deck the Halls to Hotel California, from Baba Black Sheep to this theme from Sex and the City, is all made up of a combination of these 12 tones and their octaves. To add to the confusion, musicians also use the term sharp and flat to indicate if someone is playing out of tune. If the musician plays the tone a bit too high, but not so high as to make the next note on the scale, we say that that note is being played sharp. And the musician plays the note too low, and we say the tone is flat. Of course, a musician can be only slightly off and nobody would notice, but when the musician is off by a relatively large amount, say 1/4 to 1/2 the distance between the note she was trying to play in the next one, most of us can usually detect this and it sounds off. This is especially apparent when there is more than one instrument playing, and the out of tune we are hearing clashes with in tune tones being played simultaneously by other musicians. The names of pitches are also associated with particular frequency waves. Our current frequency system is called A440 because the note we call A that is in the middle of the piano keyboard has been fixed to the frequency 440 Hz. This is entirely arbitrary. We could fix A at any frequency, such as 439, 444, 424, or 314.159. Different standards were used at the time of Mozart's and today. Some people claim that the precise frequencies affect the overall sound of a musical piece and the sound of instruments. Led Zeppelin often tune their instruments away from the modern A440 standard to give their music an uncommon sound, and perhaps to link it with European children's folk songs that inspired many of their compositions. Many purists insist on hearing Bach music on Barque, I'm not sure how to pronounce that, on period instruments. Both because the instruments have a different sound and because they are designed to play the music in its original tuning standard, something that the purists deem important. We can fix pitches at anywhere we want because what defines music is a set of pitch relations. The specific frequencies for notes may be arbitrary, but the distance from one frequency to the next, hence one note to the next in our musical system, isn't at all arbitrary. Each note in our musical system is equally spaced to our ears, but not necessarily to the ears of other species. Although there is not an equal change in cycles per second, hertz, as we climb from one note to the next, the distance between each note and the next sounds equal. How can this be? The frequency of each note in our system is approximately 6% more than the one before it. Our auditory system is sensitive to both relative changes and to proportional changes in sound. Thus, each increase in frequency of 6% gives us the impression that we have increased pitch by the same amount as we did last time. The idea of proportional change is intuitive if you think about weights. If you're at a gym and you want to increase weightlifting of the barbells from 5 pounds to 50 pounds, adding 5 pounds each week is going to change the amount of weight you're lifting in an equal way. After a week of lifting 5 pounds, when you move to 10, you are doubling the weight. The next week to 15, you are adding 1.5 times as much weight as you had before, in equal spacing. To give your muscles a similar increase of weight each week would be to add a constant percentage of previous week's weight each time you increase. For example, you might want to add 50% each week. So you would go from 5 pounds to 7.5, then to 11.25, then to 16.83, and so on. The auditory system works the same way, and that is why our scale is based on proportion. Each tone is 6% higher than the previous one, and when we increase each step 6% 12 times, we end up having it doubled our original frequency. The actual proportion is the 12th. The actual proportion is the 12th root of 2, 1.059463. Continued. The 12 notes in our musical system are called the chromatic scale. Any scale is simply a set of musical pitches that have been chosen to be distinguishable from each other and to be used for the basis of constructing melodies. In Western music, we rarely use the notes of the chromatic scale in composition. Instead, we use a subset of 7, or less often 5, of those 12 note tones. Each of these subsets is itself a scale, and the type of scale we use has a large impact on the overall sound of a melody and its emotional qualities. The most common subset of 7 tones in Western music is called the major scale, or Ionian mode, reflecting to its ancient Greek origins. Like all scales, it can start off on any of the 12 notes, and what defines the major scale is the specific pattern or distance relationship between each note and its successive note. In any major scale, the pattern of intervals, pitch distance between successful keys, is a whole step, half step, whole step, whole step, whole step, half step. Starting on C, the major scale notes are C, D, E, F, G, A, B, C, all white notes on the piano keyboard. All other major scales require one or more black notes to maintain the required whole step, half step pattern. The starting pitch is also called the tonic of the scale. The particular placement of the 2 half steps in the sequence of the major is crucial. It is not only what defines a major scale and distinguishes it from other scales, but is also an important ingredient in musical expectations. Experiments have shown that young children, as well as adults, are better able to learn and memorize melodies that are drawn from scales that contain unequal distances such as this. The presence of the 2 half steps and their particular positions orient the experienced, articulated listener to where they are in the scale. We're all experts in knowing when we hear a B in the C of key, that's where the tones are being primarily drawn from the major scale. We're all experts in knowing when we hear B in the key of C, that is, when the tones are being drawn primarily from the C major scale, that is the 7th note, or degree, of that scale. And that only a half step below the tonic, even though most of us can't name the notes, and may not know what a tonic or a scale degree is. We have assimilated the structure of this and other scales throughout a lifetime of listening in passive, rather than theoretical-driven, exposure to music. This knowledge is not innate, but what is gained through experience. By a similar token, we don't need to know anything about cosmology to have learned that the sun comes up every morning and goes down at night. We have learned this through the sequence of events through largely passive exposure. Different steps of whole steps and half steps give rise to alternative scales, the most common of which in our culture is the minor scale. There is one minor scale, like the C major scale, uses only white notes of the piano keyboard, the A minor scale. The pitches for the scale are A, B, C, D, E, F, G, A. Because it uses the same set of pitches, but in a similar order, Minor is said to be the relative minor of the C major scale. The pattern of the whole steps and half steps is different from that of the major scale. Whole, half, whole, half, whole. Notice that the placement of the half steps is very different than in the major scale. In the major scale, there is a half step just before the tonic that leads to the tonic, and another half step just before the fourth degree scale. In the minor scale, the half steps are before the third degree scale and before the sixth. There is still a momentum when we are in the scale to return to the tonic, but the chords that create this momentum have a clearly different sound and emotional trajectory. Now you might well ask, if these two scales are used exactly the same set of pitches, how do I know which one I'm playing in? If a musician is playing the white keys, how do I know if he is playing the A minor scale, or the C major scale? The answer is that, entirely without our conscious awareness, our brains are keeping track of how many particular notes are sounded, where they appear in terms of strong versus weak beats, and how long they last. A computational process in the brain makes an inference about the key we're based in on these priorities. This is another example of something that most of us can do without the musical training and without what psychologists call declarative knowledge. The ability to talk about it, but in spite of our lack of formal musical education, we know what the composer intended to establish as the tonal center or key of the piece. And we recognize when he brings back home to the tonic, or when he fails to do so. The simplest way to establish a key, then, is to play the tonic of the key many times, play it loud, and play it long, even if the composer thinks he's writing in C major scale. If he has the musicians play the note A over and over again, play it loud, and play it long. If the composer starts the piece on an A, ends on the piece on an A, and moreover, if he avoids the use of C, the audience, musicians, and music theorists are most probably going to decide that the piece is in A minor, even if this is not his intent. In musical keys, as in speeding tickets, it is the observed action, not the intent, that counts. For reasons that are largely cultural, we tend to associate major scales with happy or triumphant emotions, and minor scales with sad or defeated emotions. Some studies have suggested that associations may be innate, but the fact that these are not culturally universal indicates that at the very least, any innate tendency can be overcome by exposure to specific cultural associations. Western music theory recognizes 3 minor scales, and each has a slightly different flavor. Blues, minor scale, and Chinese music uses a different pentatonic scale. When Tchaikovsky wants us to think of Arab or Chinese culture in the Nutcracker Ballet, he chooses scales that are typical to their music, and within a few notes we are transported to the Orient. When Billie Holiday wants to make a standard tune bluesy, she invokes the blues scale and sings notes from a scale that we are not accustomed to hearing in standard classical music. Composers know these associations and use them intentionally. Our brains know them too, through a lifetime of exposure to musical idioms, patterns, scales, lyrics, and the associations between them. Each time we hear a musical pattern that is new to our ears, our brains try to make an association through whatever visual, auditory, and other sensory cues accompany it. We try to contextualize the new sounds, and eventually we create these memory links between a particular set of notes in a particular place, time, or set of events. No one who has seen Hitchcock's Psycho can hear Bernard Herrmann's screeching violins without thinking of the shower scene. Anyone who's ever seen a Warner Bros. Melody cartoon will think of a character sneakily climbing stairs whenever they hear plucking violins playing in an ascending major scale. The associations are so powerful in the scales distinguishable enough that only a few notes are needed. The first 3 notes of David Bowie's China Girl or Mussorgsky's Great Gate of Kiev and Pictures at Expedition instantly convey a rich and foreign to us, musical context. Nearly all of this variation in context and sound comes from different ways of dividing up the octave in virtually every case we know of, dividing it into one or more than 12 notes. Although it has been claimed that Indian and Arab Persian music uses microtuning scales, and with intervals much smaller than a semitone, close analysis reveals that their scales also rely on 12 or fewer tones, and the others are simply expressive variations, glissandos, continuous glides from one tone to another, and momentary passing tones, similar to the American blues tradition of sliding into a note for emotional purposes. In any scale, a hierarchy of importance exists among scale tones, some more stable, structurally significant, or final sounding than the others, causing us to feel varying amounts of tension and resolution. In the major scale, the most stable tone is the first degree, also called the tonic. In other words, all other tones in the scale seem to point towards the tonic. When they point with varying momentum, the tone that points the most strongly to the tonic is the seventh scale degree, B, in a major C scale. The tone that points least strongly to the tonic is the fifth scale, C, in the C major scale, and it points least strongly because it is perceived as relatively unstable. This is another way of saying that we don't feel uneasy, unresolved, if a song ends in the fifth scale degree. Music theory specifies this tonal hierarchy. Carol Krumhanschel and her colleagues performed a series of studies establishing that ordinary listeners have incorporated the principles of this hierarchy in their brains through their passive exposure to music and cultural norms. By asking people to rate how well different tones seem to fit with a scale, she would play them. She would recover from their subjective judgments the theoretical hierarchy. A chord is simply a group of three or more tones played at the same time. They are generally drawn from one of the commonly used scales, and the three notes are chosen so that they convey information about the scale they were taken from. A typical chord is built from playing the first, third, and fifth notes of a scale together. Because the sequence of whole steps and half steps is different for minor and major scales, the interval sizes are different for chords taken this way from the two different scales. If we build the chord starting on C and use the tones from the C major scale, we use C, E, and G. If we instead use the C minor scale, the first, third, and fifth notes are C, E flat, and G. The difference in the third degree between E and E flat turns the chord itself from a major chord into a minor chord. All of us, even without musical training, can tell the difference between these two even if we don't have the terminology to name them. We hear the major chord as sounding happy and the minor chord as sounding sad, or reflective, even exotic. The most basic rock and country music songs use only major chords. Johnny Be Good, Blown in the Wind, Honky Tonk Women, and Mamas Don't Let Your Babies Grow Up to Be Cowboys, for example. Minor chords add complexity. In Light My Fire by the Doors, the verses are played in minor chords. You know that it would be untrue. And then the chorus is played in major chords. Come On Baby, Light My Fire. And Jolene, Dolly Parton mixes minor and major chords to give a melancholy sound. Steely Dan's Do It Again from the album Can't Buy a Thrill only uses minor chords. Like single notes in the scale, chords also fall along a hierarchy of stability, depending on context. Certain chord progressions are a part of every musical tradition, and even by the age of 5, most children have internalized the rules about what chord progressions are legal, or typical of their culture's music, and they can readily detect deviations from the standard sequences just as easily as we can detect when an English sentence is malformed, such as this one: the pizza was just too hot to sleep. For the brains to accomplish this, the networks of neurons must form abstract representations of music structure and musical notes, something that they do automatically and without our conscious awareness. Our brains are maximally repetitive, almost sponge-like when you're young, hungrily soaking up any and all sounds they can get, incorporating them with the very structure of our neural wiring. As we age, these neural circuits are somewhat less pliable, so it becomes more difficult to incorporate at a deep neural level new musical systems or even new linguistic systems. Now, the story about pitch becomes a little bit more complicated. It's all about the fault of psychics. physics. But at this but this complication gives rise to the rich spectrums of sounds we hear in different instruments. All natural sounds in the world have several notes of vibrations. A piano string actually vibrates at several different rates at once. The same thing is true of bells that we hit with a hammer, drums that we hit with our hands, or flutes that we blow air into. The air molecules vibrate at several rates simultaneously, not just a single rate. An analogy is the several types of motion of the Earth that are simultaneously occurring. We know that the Earth spins on its axis once every 24 hours, that it travels around the Sun once every 365.25 days, and the entire solar system is spinning along with the Milky Way galaxy. Several types of motion, all occurring at once. Another analogy is the many kinds of vibrations that we often feel when riding a train. Imagine that you're sitting in a train on an outdoor station with the engine off. It's windy, and you feel the car rock back and forth just a bit. It does so with a regularity that you can time with your handy stopwatch, and you feel the train moving back and forth about twice a second. Next, the engineer starts the engine, and you feel a different kind of vibration through your seat due to the oscillation of the motors, pistons, and crankshafts turning around at a certain speed. When the train starts moving, you experience a third sensation, the bump the wheels make every time they go over a track joint. Altogether, you will feel several different kinds of vibrations. All of them are likely to be at different rates or frequencies. When the train is moving, you are no doubt aware that there is vibration, but it is very difficult, if not impossible, for you to determine how many vibrations there are and what their rates are. Using specialized measuring instruments, however, one might be able to figure this out. When a sound is generated on a piano, flute, or any other instrument, including percussion instruments like drums and cowbells, it produces many modes of vibration occurring simultaneously. When you listen to a single note on an instrument, you're actually hearing many pitches at once, not a single pitch. Most of us are not aware of this consciously, although some people can train themselves to hear this. The one with the slowest vibration rate, the one lowest in pitch, is referred to as the fundamental frequency, and and the others are collectively called overtones. To recap, it is a property of objects in the world that they generally vibrate at different frequencies at once. Surprisingly, these other frequencies are often mathematically related to each other in a very simple way, as integer multiples of one another. So if you pluck a string at its slowest vibration is 100 times per second, the other vibration frequencies will be 2 times 100, 200 hertz, 3 times 100 hertz, 300 hertz, etc. If you blow into a flute or other recorder and cause vibrations at 310 hertz, additional vibrations will be occurring at twice, 3 times, 4 times, etc. at this rate. 620 hertz, 930 hertz, 1240 hertz, etc. When an instrument creates an energy at frequencies that are integer multiples such as this, we say that the frequency is harmonic, and we refer to this pattern of energy at different frequencies as the overtone series. There is evidence that the brain responds to such harmonic sounds with synchronous neural firings, the neurons and auditory cortex responding to each of the components of the sound synchronize their firing rates with one another, creating a neural basis for the coherence of these sounds. The brain is so attuned to the overtone series that if we encounter a sound that has all of the components except the fundamental, the brain fills in for us in a phenomenon called restoration of the missing fundamental. A sound composed of energy at 100 Hz, 200 Hz, 300 Hz, 400 Hz, and 500 Hz is perceived as having a pitch of 100 Hz, its fundamental frequency. But if we artificially create a sound with energy at 200 Hz, 300 Hz, 400 Hz, and 500 Hz, leaving off the fundamental, we still perceive it as having having a pitch of 100 Hz. We do not perceive it as having a pitch of 200 Hz because our brain knows that this is a normal harmonic sound with a pitch of 200 Hz. Would have overtone series of 200 Hz, 400 Hz, 600 Hz, 800 Hz, etc. We can also fool the brain by playing sequences that deviate from the overtone series, such as this: 100 Hz, 210 Hz, 302 Hz, 405 Hz, etc. In cases like this, the perceived pitch sways away from 100 Hz in a compromise between what is presented and what a normal harmonic series would imply. When I was in graduate school, my advisor, Mike Posner, told me about the work of a graduate student in biology, Peter Piteo Jatana, Although he hadn't been raised in San Francisco like me, Peter had long bushy hair that he wore in a ponytail, played jazz and rock piano, and dressed in tie-dye, a true kindred spirit. Peter played electronics in the inferior colchis of the barn owl, part of its auditory system. Then he played the owls a version of Strauss's The Blue Danbu Waltz, made up of tones from which the fundamental frequency had been removed. Peter hypothesized that if the missing fundamental is restored at early levels of auditory processing, the neurons in the owl's inferior colchis should fire at the rate of the missing fundamental. This is exactly what he found, and because the electrodes put out a small electrical signal with each firing, and because the firing rate is the same as the frequency of firing as we saw above, Peter sent out the output of these electrodes to a small amplifier and played back the sound of the owl's neurons through a loudspeaker. What he heard was astonishing. The melody of the Blue Danbu Waltz, sang clearly from the loudspeakers, ba da 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 dee 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 dee. We were hearing firing rates of the neurons, and they were identical to the frequency of the missing fundamental. The overtone series had an instantation not just in the early levels of auditory processing, but in a completely different species. One could imagine an alien species that does not have ears, or doesn't have the same internal experience of hearing that we do, but it would be so difficult to imagine an advanced species that had no ability whatsoever to sense vibrating objects. Where there is no atmosphere, there are molecules that vibrate. Where there is atmosphere, there are molecules that vibrate in response to movement. And knowing whether something is generating noise or moving toward or away from us, even when we can't see it because it's dark, our eyes aren't attending to it, or we're asleep, has a great survival value. Because most physical objects cause molecules to vibrate in several modes at once, and because for many objects in the modes bear simple integer relations to one another, the overtone series is a fact of the world that we expect to find everywhere we look. In North America, in Fiji, on Mars, and other planets orbiting Antares, any organism evolved in a world with vibrating objects is likely given enough evolutionary time to have evolved a processing unit in the brain that has incorporated these regularities of its world. Because pitch is a fundamental cue to an object's identity, we would expect to find tonotopic mappings as we do in the human auditory cortex, and synchronous neural firings for tones that bear octave and other harmonic relations to one another. This would help the brain, alien or terrestrial, to figure out that all these tones probably originated from the same object. The overtones are often referred to by numbers. The first overtone is the first vibration frequency above the fundamental. The second overtone is the second vibration frequency above the fundamental, etc. Because physicists like to make the world confusing for the rest of us, there's a parallel system of terminology called harmonics, and I think it is designed to make us undergraduates go crazy. In the lingo of harmonics, the first harmonic is the fundamental frequency, the second frequency is equal to the first overtone, and so on. Not all instruments vibrate in modes that are so neatly defined. Sometimes, as with the piano, because it is a percussive instrument, so the overtones can be close, but not exact. Multiples of the fundamental frequency, and this contributes to the characteristic sound. Percussion instruments, chimes, and other objects, depending on composition and shape, often have overtones that are clearly not integer multiples of the fundamental, and these are called partials or inharmonic overtones. Generally, instruments with inharmonic overtones lack the clear sense of pitch that we associate with harmonic instruments, and the cortical basis for this may relate to a lack of synchronous neural firing. But we do still find a sense of pitch, and we hear this most clearly when we play inharmonic notes in succession. Although you may not be able to hum along with the sound of a single note played on a woodblock or a chime, we can play a recognizable melody on a set of woodblocks of chimes because our brain focuses on the changes in the overtones from one to another. This is essentially what is happening when we hear people playing a song in their cheeks. A flute, a violin, a trumpet, and a piano can all play the same tone, that is. You can write a note on a musical score, and each instrument will play a tone with identical fundamental frequency, and we will tend to hear an identical pitch. But these instruments all sound different from one another. This difference is timbre, and it is the most important and ecologically relevant feature of auditory events. The timbre of a sound is the principal feature that distinguishes the growl of a lion from the purr of a cat. The crack of thunder from the whoosh of ocean waves, the voice of a friend from that of a bill collector one is trying to dodge. Timbral discrimination is so acute in humans that most of us can recognize hundreds of different voices. We can tell whether someone close to us, our mother or spouse, is happy or sad, healthy or coming down with cold, based on the timbre of that voice. Timbre is a consequence of the overtones. Different materials have different densities. A piece of metal will tend to sink to the bottom of a pond, and an identically sized and shaped piece of wood will float, partially due to the density and partially due to the size and shape. Different objects also make different noises when you strike them with your hand, or gently with a hammer. Imagine the sound that you hear when you tap a hammer, gently please, against a guitar. A hollow wooden plunk sound. Or if you tap a piece of metal, like a saxophone, a tiny plink. When you tap these objects, the energy from the hammer causes the molecules within them to vibrate, to dance at different frequencies determined by the material the object is made out of its size, and its shape. If the object is vibrating, say at 100 Hz, 200 Hz, 300 Hz, 400 Hz, etc., the intensity of vibration doesn't have to be the same for each of these harmonics, and in fact, typically is not. When you hear a saxophone playing with the fundamental frequencies of 220 Hz, you are actually hearing many tones, not just one. The other tones you hear are integer multiples of the fundamental 440, 660, 880, 1100, 1320, 1540, etc. These different tones, the overtones, have different intensities, and so we hear them as having different loudnesses. The particular pattern of loudness for those tones is distinctive of the saxophone, and they are what give rise to its unique tonal color. Its unique sound, its timbre, a violin, playing the same written note, 220 Hz, will have overtones at the same frequencies, but the pattern of how loud each one is with respect to the others will be different. Indeed, for each instrument, there exists a unique pattern of overtones. For one instrument, the second overtone might be louder than in another, while the fifth overtone might be softer. Virtually all of the tonal variation we hear, the quality that gives a trumpet its trumpetness and what gives its piano its pianoness, comes from the unique way in which the loudness of the overtones are distributed. Each instrument has its own overtone profile, which is like a fingerprint. It is a complicated pattern that we can use to identify the instrument. Clarinets, for example, are characterized by having relatively high amounts of energy in the odd harmonics, 3 times, 5 times, and 7 times the multiples of the fundamental frequency, etc. This is a consequence of there being a tube that is connected at one end and open at the other. Trumpets are characterized by having a relatively even amounts of energy in both the odd and even harmonics. Like the clarinet, the trumpet is also closed at one end and open at the other, but the mouthpiece and bell are designed to smooth out the harmonic series. A violin that is bowed in the center will yield mostly odd harmonics and accordingly can sound similar to a clarinet, but bowing one third of bowing one third of the way down the instrument emphasizes the third harmonic and its multiples, the sixth, ninth, and 12th, etc. All the all trumpets have a timbral fingerprint, and it is readily distinguishable from the timbral fingerprint for a violin, piano, or even the human voice. To the trained ear, and to most musicians, there even exist differences amongst trumpets. All trumpets don't sound alike, nor do all pianos, or all accordions. What distinguishes one particular piano from another is that their overtone profiles will differ slightly from each other, but not, of course, as much as they will differ from their profile for a harpsichord, organ, or tuba. Master musicians can hear the difference between a Stradivarius violin and a Guarneri within one or two notes. I can hear the difference between my 1956 Martin Triple 18 acoustic guitar, my 1973 Martin D18, and my 1996 Collins D2H very clearly. They sound like different instruments, even though they're all acoustic guitars. I would never confuse one with each other. That is timbre. Natural instruments, that is, acoustic instruments made out of real-world materials such as metal and wood tend to produce energy at several frequencies at once because of the way the internal structure of their molecules vibrates. Suppose that I invent an instrument unlike any other natural instruments we know of produces energy at once, and, and only one frequency. Let's call this hypothetical instrument a generator, because it can generate tones at specific frequencies. If I line up a bunch of generators, I could set each one of them to play at a specific frequency corresponding to the overtone series for a particular instrument playing at an particular tone. I could have a bank of these generators making sounds at 110 Hz, 220 Hz, 330, 440, 550, and 660 Hz, which would give the listener an impression of 110 Hz tone played by a musical instrument. Furthermore, I could control the amplitude of each of my generators and make each of the tones play at a particular loudness corresponding to the overtone profile of a natural musical instrument. If I did that, the result of bank of generators would approximate the sound of a clarinet or flute or any other instruments I was trying to emulate. Additive synthesis, such as the above approach, achieves a synthetic version of a music-like timbre by adding together elemental sonic components of the sound. Many pipe organs, such as those found in churches, have a feature that will let you play around with this. On most pipe organs, as you press a key or a pedal, which sends a blast of air through a metal pipe. The organ is constructed of hundreds of pipes of different sizes, and each one a different pitch, corresponding to its size. When air is shot through it, you can think of them each as mechanical flutes, in which the air is supplied by an electric motor rather than a person blowing. The sound that we associate with a church organ, its particular timbre, is a function of there being energy at different frequencies at once, just as with other instruments. Each pipe of the organ produces an overtone series, and when you press key on the organ keyboard, a column of air is blasted through more than one pipe at a time, giving a very rich spectrum of sounds. These supplementary pipes, in addition to the one that vibrates at the fundamental frequency of the tone you're trying to play, either produce tones that are integer multiples of their fundamental frequency or closely related to it, mathematically and harmonically. The organ player typically has control over which of these supplementary pipes he wants to blow air through by pulling and pushing levers or drawbars that direct the flow of air. Knowing that clarinets have a lot of energy in the odd harmonics of the overtone series, a clever organ player could simulate the sound of a clarinet by manipulating the drawbars in such a way as to recreate the overtone series of that instrument. A little bit of 220 Hz here, a dash of 330 Hz, a dollop of 440 Hz, a helping heap of 550 Hz, and voila, you've cooked yourself up a reasonable facsimile of an instrument. Starting in the late 1950s, scientists began experimenting with building such synthesis capabilities into smaller, more compact electronic devices, creating a family of musical instruments known collectively as synthesizers. By the 1960s, synthesizers could be heard on records on the Beatles, on Here Comes the Sun, and Maxwell's Silver Hammer, and Walter Wendy Carlos switched on Bach, followed by a group who sculpted their sound around the synthesizer, such as and Emerson, Lake, and Palmer. Many of these synthesizers used additive synthesis, as I've described it here, and later ones use more complex algorithms such as waveguide synthesis, invented by Julius Smith at Stanford, and FM synthesis, invented by John Trelling at Stanford. But merely copying the overtone profile, while it can create a sound reminiscent of the actual instrument, yields a rather pale copy. There is more to timbre than just the overtone series. Researchers still argue about what this more is, but there is generally accepted that, in addition to the overtone profile, timbre is more defined by two other attributes that give rise to a perceptual difference from one instrument to another. Attack and flux. Stanford University sits on a bullock stretch of land just south of San Francisco and east of the Pacific Ocean. Rolling hills covered with pasture land to the west, and fertile Central Valley of California is just an hour or so east, home of the large proportion of the world's raisins, cotton, oranges, and almonds. To the south, near the town of Gilroy, are vast fields of garlic. Also to the south is Casterville, known as the artichoke capital of the world. I once suggested to the Casterville Chamber of Commerce that they should change capital to heart. The response was not enthusiastic. Stanford has become something of a second home for computer scientists and engineers who love music. John Chowing, who is well known for his avant-garde composer as an avant-garde composer, has a professionalism has a professorship in the music department there since the 1970s, and was among some of the pioneering composers at the time who were using computer to create, store, and reproduce sounds of their compositions. Chowning later became the founding member of the Center for the Computer Research in Music and Acoustics at Stanford, known as CCRMA, pronounced Karma. Insiders joke that the C is silent. Chowning is warm and friendly. Chowning is warm and friendly. When I was an undergraduate at Stanford, he would put his hands on my shoulder and ask what I was working on. I get the feeling talking to a student was for him an opportunity to learn something. In the early 1970s, while fiddling with a computer and with sine waves, the sort of artificial sounds that are made by computers and used as the building blocks of additive synthesis, Chowning noticed that the changing of the frequencies of these waves as they playing created sounds that were musical. By controlling these parameters just so, he was able to simulate the sounds of a number of musical instruments. So this new technique became known as frequency modulation synthesis, or FM synthesis, and the first embedded became first embedded in the Yamaha DX9 and the DX7 line of synthesizers, which revolutionized the music industry from the moment of their introduction in 1983. FM synthesizers democratized music synthesis. Before FM, synthesizers were expensive, clunky, and hard to control. Creating new sounds took a great deal of time, experimentation, and know-how. But with FM, any musician can obtain a convincing instrument sound at the touch of a button. Songwriters and composers who could not afford to hire a horn section or an orchestra can now play around with these textures and sounds. Composers and orchestrators could test out arrangements before taking the time of an entire orchestra to see what worked and what didn't. New wave bands like the Cars and Pretenders, as well as mainstream artists like Stevie Wonder, Hall & Oates, and Phil Collins started to use FM synthesizers widely in their recordings. A lot of what we think as the 80s sound in popular music owes its distinctiveness to the particular sound of FM synthesis. With the popularization of FM came a steady stream of royalty income that allowed Chowning to build up CCRMA, attracting graduate students and top flight faculty members. Among the first of the famous electronic music psychology celebrities to come to the Karma were John John R. Pierce and Max Matthews. Pierce had been to the vice president of research at the Bell Telephone Laboratories in New Jersey and supervised the team of engineers who built and patented the transistor, and it was Pierce who named the evidence transfer resistor in his distinguished career. He was also accredited with inventing the traveling wave vacuum tube and launching the first telecommunication satellite, Telstar. He was also a respected science fiction writer under the pseudonym J.J. Coupling. Pierce created a rare environment in any industry or research lab, one in which the scientists felt empowered to do their best, and which creativity was highly valued. At the time, Bell Telephone (AT&T) had a complete monopoly on the telephone service in the U.S. and a large cash reserve. Their laboratory was creating something of a playground for the very best and brightest inventors, engineers, and scientists in America. In the Bell Labs sandbox, Pierce allowed his people to become creative without worrying about the bottom line or the applicability of their ideas to commerce. Pierce understood that the only one, the only true invitation can occur when people don't have to censor themselves and can let their ideas run free. Although only a small portion of those ideas may be practical, and smaller proportion would still be products of those that did not that did that did would be innovative, unique, and potentially very profitable. Out of this environment came a number of innovations, including lasers, digital computers, and the Unix operating system. I first met Pierce in 1990, when he was already 80 and giving lectures on psychoacoustics at Karma. Several years later, after I'd earned my PhD and moved back to Stanford, we became friends and would go out to dinner every Wednesday night and discuss research. He was once asked me to explain rock and roll music to him, something he had never paid attention to and didn't understand. He knew about my previous career in the music business and asked if I'd come over for dinner one night and play 6 songs that captured all that was important to know about rock and roll. 6 songs to capture all of rock and roll? I wasn't sure I would come up with 6 songs to capture the Beatles, let alone all of rock and roll. The night before, he would call to tell me that he heard Elvis Presley, so I didn't need to cover that. Here's what I brought to dinner: Long Tall Sally by Little Richard, Roll Over Beethoven by the Beatles, All Over the Watchtower by Jimi Hendrix, Wonderful Tonight by Eric Clapton, Little Red Corvette by Prince, and Anarchy in the UK by the Sex Pistols. A couple of the choices combined great songwriters with different performers. All are all are great songs, but even now I'd like to make some adjustments. Pierce listened and kept asking who these people are, what instruments he was hearing, and how they came to sound the way they did. Mostly he liked the timbres of the music. The songs themselves and the rhythms didn't interest him that much, but he found the timbres to be remarkable, new, unfamiliar, and exciting. The fluid romanticism of Chaplin's guitar solo in Wonderful Tonight, combined with the soft, pillowy drums, that the sheer power and density of the Sex Pistols' brick brick wall of guitars and bass, brick wall of guitars and bass and drums. The sound of distorted guitar wasn't at all new to Pierce. In ways in which instruments were combined to create a unified whole, bass, drums, electric and acoustic guitars, and voice. There was something he had never heard before. Defined rock. Timbre is what defined rock to Pierce, and it was a revelation to both of us. The pitches that we use in music, the scales, have remained essentially unchanged since the time of the Greeks, and with the exception of the development, really a refinement of the equal tempered scale during the time of Bach. Rock and roll may have the final step in a millennium-long musical revolution that gave perfect fourths and fifths a prominence in music that had historically been given only to the octave. During this time, Western music was largely dominated by pitch. For the past 200 years or so, timbre has become increasingly important, and a standard component of music across all genres is to restate a melody using different instruments from Beethoven's Fifth and Ravel's Bolero to the Beatles' Michelle and George Strait's All My Exes Live in Texas. New musical instruments have been invented so that composers may have a larger palette of timbral colors from which to draw. When a country or even popular singer stops singing and another instrument picks up the melody, even without changing it in any way, we find pleasurable the reception of the same melody with a different timbre. The avant-garde composer Pierre Schaeffer, pronounced Chauffeur using your best imitation of a French accent, Schaeffer, performed some crucial experiments in the 1950s and demonstrated an important attribute of timbre in his famous cut bell experiments. Schaeffer recorded a number of orchestral instruments on tape. Then, using a razor blade, he cut the beginnings off of these sounds. This is the very first part of a musical instrument sound is the attack. That is the sound of the initial. This is the sound of the initial hit. Strum, bowing, or blowing that causes the instrument to make a sound. The gesture our body makes in order to create sound from an instrument has an important influence on the sound the instrument makes. But most of that dies away after the first few seconds. Nearly all the gestures we produce are impulsive, they sort of punctuated bursts of activity. In percussion instruments, the musician typically does not remain in contact with the instrument after the initial burst. In wind instruments and bowed instruments, on the other hand, the musician continues to be in contact with the instrument after the initial impulsive contact. The moment when the air burst first leaves their mouth or the bow first contacts the string. The continued blowing and bowing has a smooth and continuous, less impulsive quality. The introduction of energy to an instrument, the attack phase, creates energy at many different frequencies that are not related to one another by simple integer multiples. In other words, for the brief period after we strike, blow into, pluck, or otherwise cause an instrument to start making a sound, The impact itself has a rather noisy quality that is especially musical, more like the sound of a hammer hitting a piece of wood, say, than a hammer hitting a bell or piano string, or like the sound of wind rushing through a tube. Following the attack is a more stable phase in which the musical tone takes on the ordinary pattern of overtone frequencies as the metal or wood or other material that is the instrument is made out of starts to resonate. This middle part of the musical tone is referred to as the steady state. In most instances of the overtone, profile is relatively stable while the sound emanates from the instruments during this time. After Chauffeur edited out the attack of an orchestral instrument recordings, he played back the tape and found that it was nearly impossible for most people to identify the instrument he was playing. Without the attack, pianos and bells sound remarkably unlike pianos and bells, and remarkably similar to one another. If you splice the attack of one instrument into a steady state or body from another, you get varied results. In some cases, you hear an ambiguous hybrid instrument that sounds more like an instrument that the attack came from than the one the steady state came from. Michel Castellango and others have discovered that you can create entirely new instruments this way. For example, splicing a violin bow sound onto a flute tone creates a sound that strongly resembles a hurdy-gurdy street organ. These experiments show the importance of the attack. The third dimension of timbre, flux, refers to how the sound changes after it has started playing. A cymbal or gong has a lot of flux. Its sounds changes dramatically over the timbre course of its sound. While a trumpet has less flux, its tone is more stable as it evolves. Instruments also don't sound the same across their range. That is, the timbre of each instrument sounds different when playing high and low tones. When the sting reaches up toward the top of the vocal range in Roxanne by the Police, his straining, reedy voice conveys a type of emotion that we can't achieve in the lower parts of his register, such as we hear the opening sound of Every Breath You Take, a more deliberate, longing sound. A huge part of Sting's register pleads with us urgently as his vocal cords strain. The low part of suggesting a dull aching that we feel has been going on for a long time, but has not yet reached the breaking point. Timbre is more than the different sounds an instrument makes. Composers use timbre as a compositional tool. They choose musical instruments and combinations of musical instruments to express particular emotions and convey a sense of atmosphere or mood. There's the almost comical timbre of the bassoon in Tchaikovsky's Nutcracker Suite as it opens up the Chinese dance, and the other sensuous dance of Saint-Saëns's saxophone on Here's That Rainy Day. Substitute a piano for the electric guitars in the Rolling Stones' Satisfaction, and you'd have an entirely different animal. Ravel used timbre as an expositional device in Berlioz, repeating the main theme over and over again with different timbres. He did this after he suffered brain damage that impaired his ability to hear pitch. When we think of Jimi Hendrix, it is the timbre, his electric guitars, and his voice that we are likely to recall the most vividly. Composers such as Scrambin and Ravel talk about their works as sound paintings, in which the notes and melodies are the equivalent sound and form, and the timbre is equivalent to use of color and of shading. Several popular songwriters, Stevie Wonder, Paul Simon, Lindsey Buckingham, have described their compositions as sound paintings, with timbre playing a role equivalent to the one that color does in visual art, separating melodic shapes from one another. But one of the things that makes music different from painting is dynamic changing across time, and what moves the music forward are rhythm and meter. Rhythm and meter are the engine driving virtually all music, and it is likely that they were the very first elements used in all our ancestors to create proto-musicians, a tradition that we still hear today in tribal drumming, and the rituals of various pre-industrial cultures. While I believe timbre is now at the center of our appreciation of music, rhythm has held supreme power over listeners for a very long time. So that looks like that is the end of chapter 1. So yeah. Thank you so much for spending the time listening today. Don't forget to click that subscribe button if you haven't already, and click the bell for notifications when new videos are uploaded.